Hello everyone, I am Tacit, and today I'm going to be going over the Gems of War Valed Threats event in which the Voiceless Golem is added to the game. I'm also going to be going over all the teams in this specific video, as if you thought the other 2 weeks have had too many events, this week is the exact opposite, in which there's almost nothing going on. But it's a nice break from the 2 past weeks where we pretty much had everything going on, particularly 2 weeks ago for the 8-year anniversary of the game. But anyways, let's start getting into it. So as far as the new troop itself, that's probably one of the more relevant things this week. It's actually not horrible. It comes in with a bunch of brown yellow arcanes at 200 each, so great to stock up on if you still need them. As far as the troop itself, it's a great mid-game, early-game silencing option. Silence is a bit of a weird mechanic in that it is very strong, but does not actually help you win quicker in most situations. It's one of those things that help you win, but doesn't necessarily help you win quicker. Explodes a gem and silences a random enemy for each yellow gem destroyed. Basically meaning you can pretty consistently triple or quad silence. While it is random which one is chosen every single time, so for example, if one troop is already silenced and you've silenced 3 more of them, you're not going to silence every single one of them, as it can repeat on top of the one that's already silenced. However, if you hit 4 yellow gems, it will consistently silence every single thing on the opposing team, so you can end up doing that consistently. So it's going to be pretty much a low mana cost. As far as all the golems are concerned, it's towards the higher side, but compared to how other silence options are concerned, it's among one of the cheapest silence options, and pretty accessible too with its lower rarity, only being at Epic, whereas most things that do it are Legends or above. So it'll be interesting to see how this pans out. It's definitely really safe to use, but not really going to give you any momentum. You're basically running a 3 versus 4, where the enemy can't really cast as well. It's also hard countered a lot by anything that is immune to silence, of course, as ideally if you're using this, the entire team does not have any immune at all to silence, or you have a way to work around it like with stun, curse stun, or something similar in order to get it down. However, given that this is already taken up on your slots, you're likely going to want to use this only against teams that don't have immune to silence, as it'll require at least 2, if not 3 slots, in order to fully make it work otherwise, whereas you could just simply do it with 1 and have a team of 3 to end up going with it. Similar to many golems, it does have 50% score reduction, so it has that going for it. I can see this being used more so in early to mid game, more so as an option to make sure that you don't end up taking that much damage, as you can use it in first slots to not only tank, but also make sure that tank against skulls, but also make sure that the enemy doesn't really get anything on you as far as casting. So has that going for it. It's a utility troop that's very rarely going to get used, but is worth keeping an eye on, as it is one of the more cheaper, consistent ways to end up applying silence. So as far as the event key drop table, it's actually good this week. Mostly because of the mythics. The mythics for this place are pretty insane. As far as what is not in the drop table, everything that's not in the Pansville event key drop table are just the 4 faction troops, oddly enough. As I don't believe there is any 5th or 6th here. It does seem to be only the 4 faction troops. However, what is in the drop table are some pretty decent mythics, particularly Wild Queen and Wild King. So, Wild Queen and Wild King are both skull spam related mythics that have some capability of looping. They're not perfect loops, they're not infinite loops, but they generally loop long enough to win. They're both generally Guild War options, though you can use Wild King more so for Explore 12 and other similar locations, where you don't care if you end up dying out. So Wild Queen is a lot safer, ends up stealing a bunch of attack from an enemy and giving it to your first slot, and creating a mix of green and skulls. This is generally used in a Guild War context, so you can use it in pretty much any context where you just want to run a skull spam team, where you end up reducing down the attack of the enemy. This works best in modes where 2 Castifer will basically zero out the attack of an enemy. If it requires too many, like you're up against something that has like 300 attack when you're only taking out like maybe 70, it is not going to end up being worth it. However, if you could double cast to zero out their attack, pretty much any context where you're in a mode where that can happen, she is potentially worth incorporating onto your team if you're looking to build a skull spam team. Alternatively, Wild King's kind of interesting in that he doesn't invest everything into one troop and try to keep that troop safe, but instead invests it into your entire team and just goes for all-out damage. And enrage every single ally, which is 1.5 times damage when they take a skull, and also gives them a bunch of attack on top of that. So we'll still be able to hit their traits. So this is going to be rather interesting as far as how you end up using it, depending on the mode, because how you use it in something like a Guild War is a bit different than how you would use it in Explore 12. Because an interesting thing about his mechanic since he's enraging everything, is you theoretically gain damage every single time you take a death. And I mean that in the sense that if your first slot takes a skull and then immediately dies to his skull, it ended up using the enrage and then proceeded to not have enrage. And in it not having enrage anymore, it technically has lower damage. But then it dies, but then your next slot has basically the exact same attack value while still having the enrage effect. So you're basically gaining damage from a death due to the fact that your first slot used the enrage, but your second slot didn't. And so for when your second slot dies and then your third slot didn't. So you can keep doing that over and over again. Obviously, this is not usable in something like, or you can't do that strategy in something like Guild War, where you get penalized for, or an Underworld, where, you know, you completely lose your troop for the rest of the faction. But it's more so like an Explore 12 or like quick PvP kind of mechanic that you can do with it. Alternatively, he can just be used as just a general skull spammer. It is a lot riskier than Wild Queen, but his overall damage output is substantially higher due to the enrage. So it's kind of a trade-off depending on which one you kind of want to do. They can be incorporated together as well, and they can be fit into quite a few various skull spam teams depending on what you're looking for, and are by far the most useful things in the event key drop table. Do keep in mind they're mythics, so their drop rate is very, very low. However, it is potentially worth seeking them out, especially if you're missing both of them, as having at least one of them is a really good option. There's also Pan that you could accidentally get. It's kind of okay. If nothing else, it's impervious. It can kind of shuffle around the team. Not that good, but if you do end up getting it, it's kind of usable. But the two that you're really looking for, the two wild ones, that also work with Wild Folk synergy, since they're both Elemental and Wild Folk. I just use Elemental Wild Folk. They're both Wild Folk, though. Which is also weird, because you can end up incorporating her with Mirage Queen, but you can't end up doing that with him. But anyways, overall, good event key drop table if you're looking for mythics. Otherwise, the drop table is pretty average, and not really something you'd necessarily seek out unless you're looking to get Kingdom Stars, of which it can currently reach 24 as of this week. Anyways, aside from that, as far as the world event is concerned, the world event is pretty straightforward. We have extra magic damage, and we have access to Blade Dancer. So all you have to do is use Blade Dancer. How you want to do that really depends on what on earth you want to build. However, just put a Blade Dancer on your team and you're good to go. It works very similar to how like Tesla and other similar things, and not quite like Tesla, but pretty similar, in this mode, where they kind of go and scale way out of hand due to how the boost ratio works with magic, as they were never really balanced around such a mechanic. As far as what rooms you have to take, easiest way to know what to do is just don't take Trent. If you don't take Trent, you're probably taking the right room. That's as easy as you need to know. It has like the 15-15 kind of method where, you know, you have like the 15 rooms for like a few of them, then you have like another 15 where it adds like a couple more. But as long as you just don't take Trent, you're taking the right room for the most part. So just don't do that. It is a little bit more complicated in that you might want to, like basically it's rarity order and don't take Trent. As long as you're doing that, you're fine. Anyways, as far as the other events that we have going on this week, which are almost none. Tuesday, we're going to be having the Pan's Vale faction, the Warrens. Also, oddly enough, fun fact, it is still, to this day, the only faction that you get arcane trait zones for on the final fight. Why? I have no clue. If not mistaken, it's green-yellow arcanes you end up getting on the very last fight, technically making it among one of the more common arcanes in the game, as you can farm them pretty much whenever just by doing Pan's Vale. It's a bit of a strange mechanic, but it is unique only to Pan's Vale. Wednesday, we just have the Pan's Vale pet. Unfortunately, nothing too special there. It's been out for a while. Thursday, we have ourselves the Bard hero class. Once again, not really too special for hero class. Has situations where it's used, most notably 4x Wild Folk team. But aside from 4x Wild Folk team, it's very, very rarely brought out for any other purpose. And as you can already see from the timer here, we have a Bounty Hunter this Friday, which plays the same as pretty much every Bounty Hunter. The new Bounty Hunter troop that's coming in isn't really changing that at all. Just simply going to be a pretty standard bounty event, where you carry with 3 troops and have the bounty captain all the way in the back. Pretty standard for a bounty event there. Also, I haven't been mentioning it necessarily every single week, but don't forget, we do still have the Kingdom Pass going on. This started at the 8-year anniversary week of Gems of War, and is still the only event still kind of lingering around, other than the campaign, of course. But yeah, do make sure to keep progressing on this. You can just do 10 crowns and explore every single day. Takes like 10 minutes, give or take several minutes, and you just get progress on it. The free side ends in a pretty good weapon, so you do still want to do it even if you're playing 100% free to play, or happen to not want to get this pass. Unfortunately, the paid side loot isn't too good this time around, but if you paid for it, definitely make sure to do it. You also get extra rewards if you did pay for the pass all the way at the end, so there's still an incentive to keep doing it beyond that point. Whereas if you're doing the free pass, as soon as you hit 50, you could just stop and not need to worry about it for the rest of the time. So as far as Soulforge, we do have Megavore again. We had this available about the other month, if I'm not mistaken. But it's by far the most relevant thing in the Mythic side of the Soulforge this week. Most noteworthy thing about it is that it armor tears all enemies' armor, and then there's some damage to it boosted on 2 times its magic. So it's an okay option. It's still the best way to armor tear in the entire game. Has a really gimmicky final trait where it has 8% chance to insta-kill every single time it takes an extra turn. This can end up being very devastating if it actually triggers. Biggest issue with it is it actually triggering. It's very similar to other very low percent rolls, where it does one of either 2 things, literally nothing or auto-win the fight. There's almost no in-between. But even if it doesn't trigger this a single time, it has Impervious combined with theoretically the best armor tier in the game. Technically things like Rope Dart and Zero Turn armor tiers like that, and like Mang and some other things that can get decent value, are slightly better in most contexts. However, if you're looking for the sheer armor tier amount, he has among one of the highest damage casts in the entire game, as he can tear any amount of armor. If they have 300, 500, 1,000, doesn't matter what the value is, it'll tear absolutely all of it across the entire opposing team. Very situationally usable, mostly if you're looking for like an AoE wipe team and you need they just have so much armor that you'd actually gain more value from casting Megavore first. It's very situational, but very strong in those situations. And a very gimmicky thing that's kind of fun to mess with if you want to like, build an extra turn build with it. As you could do like an AoE extra turn build like Truffle into him, and the Brown feeds into him, all that. Anyways, as far as weapons, pretty much nothing of value except for maybe Yasmine's Pride. I personally feel like Yasmine's Pride in the current state of the game doesn't have much to use it with. Catcher's the Bull has been falling off just over time in the meta, and he's one of the main things that ends up benefiting from Yasmine's Pride. So Yasmine's Pride is basically an HP buffing weapon that gives you a ton of HP. It essentially armor tiers an enemy and gives all allies life based on that. This, in theory, is insanely good and among one of the better armor tier weapons within the game. However, the biggest issue with this are the selection of options that currently boost ratio based on HP. The problem with that is there isn't much. There is very, very few troops that viably, compared to other options like armor, end up boost ratioing off of HP specifically. There's Catches the Bull. There's that one red-yellow troop, I actually forget his name, that has like a slight ratio off it. There's just nothing that gains enough of a ratio, other than maybe Catches the Bull, that can justify using Yasmine's Pride, which is the biggest issue with it. It's really good at making sure you don't die, but it's not necessarily particularly good at winning quick. Kind of like the troop we got this week for Glory. Very good at staying alive, but not necessarily good at winning quick. And that's generally what you're looking for in a lot of battles. As a longer battle lingers on, the more you could lose, and in some modes, the more points you end up losing as well. And of course, just going quicker is just better for farming if you're doing something farming related. So Yasmine's Pride is just not really usable in the current state of the game, but I do advise getting it, as even if you don't plan on using it now, there could just be a random troop that comes out of nowhere that just has some kind of insane life boost ratio, and the go-to weapon is going to be Yasmine's Pride to boost it. It is still the best HP boosting weapon in the entire game, as well as just in general among one of the best ways to end up boosting HP. So it's definitely worth considering having. You're just probably not immediately using it for anything necessarily, unless you're just messing around with like Catcher's the Bull or something similar. But I do advise getting it. Aside from that, it's pretty much just standard mana accumulation weapons if you want to get them. But if you're going to get any one thing for weapons, I would definitely consider the Yasmine's Pride, as it is a decent utility pickup that you'll use probably at some point into the future, if not necessarily immediately. Anyways, I will cover all the teams in this video right now. So let's go and show the teams. So as far as the very first one here, we have ourselves the World Law event. With this, basically just build anything around Blade Dancer. That's all you have to do. You have a spell increase, just build around Blade Dancer, you auto win, click Blade Dancer, boom, good to go. You might want to have a little bit of cleanup as you do eventually reach the point where Blade Dancer stops killing. But aside from that, just basically click Blade Dancer and win. Whatever team you end up building around that is essentially centered around that. This does use one of those Soulforge weapons, but it is available on Soulforge this week. However, you can replace that out for pretty much any other option, and just go for the Blade Dancer, and you'll be good to go. They do sometimes, once you get to a certain point, have enough armor left over. Actually, it depends what your like spell increase is. If you have enough spell increase, you can actually get away with single Blade Dancer the entire time, but it really comes down to what that value is. But I would still advise to make sure you have cleanup options. So like something that can poke, something that can mana accumulate poke. Luckily Siren works out really good for that, so if you really need to, you can just like multi up on Siren. You could even theoretically go like triple Siren Blade Dancer or something similar. but I figured hero for a little bit of tankiness on a lower team, probably a good idea. You don't have to run hero, it's generally just there for protection more so than anything. But your basic goal for this world event is get Blade Dancer to dance. Just cast Blade Dancer and then win is basically your main goal, especially if you're just staying at the lower range of battles. Anyways, next up we have green-yellow Warrens. The Warrens events going on Tuesday for the faction events. As far as teams, green-yellow unfortunately doesn't have anything kind of good for the overall Rowan experience. So you can just double up on Rowan. You don't have like the 50% mana starts or something similar. Don't have access to Tesla. One thing that you do have access to though is Double Tina 9000, which I actually used to run for this faction. But I figured I'd show the cheaper variant with Double Rowan, as it is way more accessible than Double Tina 9000. However, we did go a little bit higher on the other one for level range. We'd end up going with an Iron Gut Fiendfire. So if you ever don't feel like you have a curse option, though there are some curse options you can run on green-yellow, but if you ever feel like you need an alternative one that you just want to use in factions, Fiendfire is generally the way to go, because it can just go with no mana conflict into High King Iron Gut with his Devour, and then you have a 4x curse. It's as simple as that. You cast it, you can do it Archmagus if you want. In this case we do. It doesn't require it, but if you don't use Archmagus, do make sure to give a +1 to it, so you can get the mana up a little bit quicker. So you do have to invest your banner into +1 if you don't do it. However, since we did Archmagus, we invested our banner instead into Mare. Since Mare unfortunately can't do the +2 green, +2 red mechanic anymore, which is something that you would maybe consider with like some kind of team like this, since the banner got nerfed a couple weeks back. However, one thing you can still do is a double green into Leprechaun, as that's still +3. And then similar to how you would -1 the green on Leprechaun sometimes, you can instead -1 the red on Mare, as we are doing here. So we're just doing a +3 green, essentially, into a neutral red that doesn't interfere with her mana accumulation, since she's divisible by 3. So overall, it ends up working out okay. We're just basically using the double mana accumulation method. Keep in mind for this faction, the troop switches everything. If it casts, it will switch your first slot and last slot. So you normally want to stall in the very first fight until High King Iron Gut is back in first slot, because it will end up swapping the Leprechaun and the Iron Gut or whatever you end up putting in last slot with each other, and that won't affect turn 1 because you're casting Leprechaun turn 1. But you do want to make sure by the end of the fight, on the first fight, that you swap your team, regardless of what your team is, back to normal. Alternatively, you could go with like a different mana accumulator, kind of move that up, go with a different weapon, and then have High King Iron Gut in both first and last slot. However, that does require 2 High King Iron Guts if you happen to end up having it. So you can end up going down that route as well, if you happen to have 2 of them. As far as Pure Faction, it's basically to spam Luna. Normally just put a little bunny corn there because a little bit extra mana for the yellow. But you're essentially just AoE spamming. It's one of those AoE spam factions. It runs pretty much like any other AoE spam faction. You just want to get as much mana as quickly as possible, keep spamming, and win. You just keep damage pressuring, get as much mana as you can. Bunny Corn's just here to try to do that mana option. And yeah, just keep casting Luna until you win. It's as simple as that. Do make sure to give your bunny a +1 that's not blocked, which means brown. In this case, you could go either a +2 yellow brown or a +2 green brown. In this case, I went +2 yellow just because the bunny ends up creating yellow, but you can go either way. Though you also get a little bit extra benefit from taking yellow. You end up exploding a random gem when matching yellow gems. So you end up getting 3 explodes every single time you take a yellow, for even more reason to go down the yellow route. So for the Thursday class event, we have ourselves a Wild Folk restriction specifically to Pan's Veil. Actually, we can see what they are right here just by clicking Wild Folk, since we're already under Pan's Veil. Basically everything you see here is what's going to be available for the Thursday class event. The main option we have here is Falnessa. She does 2 things pretty well. She has Magic Link, so you can feed it into any purple weapon, which of course means we could just feed it into Black Manacle if we so choose. And she also has Empower into dealing some damage. She also ends up giving some life, but obviously not really using that life. You're more so just using her for the small damage poke that she ends up doing. And overall, it's mostly just spam Black Manacle team is the main premise that we have here. And lastly, we have Bounty Hunter. Of course, no 4th troop here, as the 4th troop is not out yet and does not come out till this Friday when we have the Bounty Hunter event. However, it plays just like any other Bounty Hunter would. You go Ogress as your tank at first slot, Tigraki to kill everything out with true damage, your Corpse Mirror behind it just for support on true damage as well as for a little bit of mana accumulation, and whatever the Bounty Captain in his last slot, so you can actually get the full 30 times multiplier when doing the Bounty event. Same as every other Bounty Hunter. Unfortunately, the new Bounty troop that's coming in isn't really going to make any kind of new meta. I am hoping that we eventually get like a Skull meta or something similar, that we can end up doing for bounty hunters, so we can kind of switch it up a little bit from just always going true damage. As it currently stands, the true damage route is still the absolute best way to go. Of course, there are other compositions you can end up doing for it, but this tends to be my go-to as far as my personal preference for running through the event. And anyways, guys, I'll wrap it up for now. All the teams, of course, will be in the description below if you want to go and copy-paste any of them. If you guys still have any other questions, feel free to also leave them there. And I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful week. Thank you, everyone, for watching.